The laughter came first, sharp, careless, and loud enough to turn heads, cutting through the late afternoon calm of Hawthorne University's stone-lined quad as Marcus Ellison slowed his steps and felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the one that warned him something small was about to become ugly. He had been replaying a voicemail from his father in his head, reminding him not to be late for the donor reception, when a police cruiser rolled to a stop beside him, tires crunching on gravel, the passenger side window already halfway down. "Hey man," one officer called out, his grin easy and unearned. "You lost?" The other officer leaned forward, scanning Marcus from hoodie to sneakers, eyes lingering a second too long on his backpack. Marcus stopped, adjusted the strap on his shoulder, and answered calmly, "No sir, I'm a student here. I'm heading to the administration building." The first officer snorted, a short laugh that carried. "A student, huh?" He glanced at his partner, who laughed louder, shaking his head as if they'd just heard a good joke. Students passed by, pretending not to see, phones half raised, curiosity mixing with discomfort. Marcus kept his voice steady, though his pulse climbed. "Yes, sir, I have class and a meeting." The driver's door opened, and the second officer stepped out, boots heavy on the path, smile fixed in place. "You don't look like admin," he said, eyes narrowing, "and this isn't exactly the neighborhood for sightseeing." Marcus felt heat rise in his neck, but forced it down, remembering every lecture, every warning, every story he'd heard growing up. He stood straight, hands visible. "I can show you my ID," he offered. The first officer laughed again, louder this time, like he was performing for an audience. "Hear that? He's got ID." A small crowd had formed now, 2 students lingering, a faculty member slowing her pace, while the officers circled closer, their humor edged with something colder. Marcus reached into his pocket, aware of how carefully he had to move, aware of how thin the line was between laughter and something far worse. And as he pulled out his wallet, he wondered, not for the first time, how many times this campus, with its banners and mottos about inclusion, had watched moments like this unfold and done nothing at all. Marcus held out his university ID, the plastic card catching the golden afternoon light, and watched the officers' expressions shift in almost imperceptible ways. The first officer snatched it from his hand, still chuckling, and squinted at the name, Marcus Ellison. He frowned. "Ellison. That sounds familiar," he muttered, tapping the card against his palm. His partner leaned in, laughter fading as he too read the name, confusion and disbelief flickering across his face. "Wait, Ellison? As in the president?" The words slipped out like a question, almost incredulous, almost too loud, as if hearing it aloud made it real. Marcus kept his posture rigid, voice measured, though every muscle in his body tensed. "Yes, sir," he said simply. "I'm his son." The officers froze. The first one blinked, swallowing, his smirk vanishing like smoke in wind. The second officer glanced around, suddenly aware of the small crowd forming, the students whispering, the professor who had paused in the distance with an eyebrow raised. The sudden silence was heavier than the laughter had ever been. One officer's hand hovered near his belt, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of instinct, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had been trained for moments like this, calm, steady, unafraid, and he could see the uncertainty flicker in their eyes. Sorry, sir," the first officer stammered, trying to regain composure, but the words sounded hollow. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging their apology without celebrating it, and began to step past them, keeping his gaze straight ahead. The taller officer cleared his throat, voice tight. You just walked right past us?" Marcus didn't answer. He walked steadily, backpack snug on his shoulder, each footstep deliberate, the faint sound of snapping twigs and gravel marking his path. The officers, caught in a sudden awareness of their own arrogance, exchanged uneasy glances, muttering lowly to one another. Marcus didn't look back, but he could feel the weight of their eyes, the shock, the disbelief, the humiliation they were only now processing. Around him, the quad seemed quieter, the few remaining students watching with wide eyes. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the courtyard, and Marcus, still composed, wondered silently how many people had faced this exact scenario but didn't have a name, a family, or power to undo the moment before it became permanent. Marcus continued down the stone path toward the administration building, his steps steady but his mind sharp, aware that every movement was being watched. The officers fell back slightly, still exchanging awkward glances. Their earlier bravado evaporated into a mix of embarrassment and cautious calculation. One of them muttered something under his breath, probably hoping Marcus wouldn't hear, but Marcus did. Every word filtered through years of experiences where he had learned to listen, to observe, to survive. Around the quad, students lingered in small clusters, phones out, whispering and nudging each other. He could feel their curiosity like static in the air. As he reached the building's front steps, the doors swung open and a campus security supervisor appeared, brisk and professional, clipboard in hand. She scanned the officers first, her eyes narrowing at the unusual tension in their posture. "Everything okay here?" she asked, tone calm but firm. The first officer cleared his throat, voice tight. Yes, ma'am, he's just a student." The supervisor's gaze shifted to Marcus, then back to the officers, and something in her expression tightened. Marcus handed her his ID as well, keeping his face composed. "I'm Marcus Ellison," he said simply. "I have a meeting scheduled with the dean." The moment the supervisor's eyes fell on the name, her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded ever so slightly. The officers stiffened, realizing the supervisor understood the significance even before they fully did. Behind them, murmurs rippled through the few lingering students. "Is that? Yeah, that's him." Marcus stepped inside the building, the cool air of the lobby washing over him, a sharp contrast to the heat outside and the tension lingering like smoke. The officers lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to follow, retreat, or call for backup, their earlier laughter now a distant echo of shame. As Marcus reached the elevators, he could feel the weight of the moment settling around him, the quiet judgment of witnesses, the knowledge that authority could be fleeting and fragile when confronted with truth. He pressed the button for the top floor, aware that the eyes of the quad and the officers would follow him until the doors closed, leaving them with nothing but their embarrassment and the realization that their assumptions had been spectacularly wrong. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft whoosh, cutting Marcus off from the quad and the officers still lingering outside. Inside, the polished interior reflected his composed expression, though beneath the surface, a surge of adrenaline coursed through him, the familiar mix of anticipation and quiet indignation he had learned to master. He pressed the button for the president's office, feeling the hum of the building beneath his feet, each floor passing slowly, marking the countdown to the confrontation he knew awaited him. Moments later, the elevator pinged at the top floor, doors sliding open to the bright, expansive hallway lined with awards, photographs, and plaques celebrating the university's legacy. Marcus strode forward, shoulders squared, and was immediately met by the office assistant, a woman who had worked with his father for decades. Her eyes widened slightly, recognition and concern flickering across her face. "Marcus, you're early," she said, masking her unease behind a forced smile. He nodded. "I had to handle a situation outside," he said calmly, leaving the officers' names unspoken but heavy in the air. She stepped aside, letting him pass, and as he approached his father's office, the large oak doors loomed like the threshold of both authority and safety. Inside, the university president looked up from his desk, papers spread out in meticulous order, his expression one of mild surprise quickly replaced with warmth. "Marcus," he said, voice steady, though a hint of concern laced his tone. "Everything all right?" Marcus placed his backpack carefully on the side chair, meeting his father's gaze. "It was complicated," he said evenly, recounting the encounter outside, emphasizing the officer's mockery without embellishment, letting the truth speak for itself. His father's eyes darkened, jaw tightening as he listened. The calm demeanor of a man used to managing crises now replaced by a simmering intensity. "I'll deal with it," he said finally, a low tone that carried both warning and authority. Marcus nodded, relief mingling with lingering tension, knowing the confrontation outside was far from over. The officers would have to answer for their behavior, and the echoes of their laughter would not vanish easily.
The office, bathed in late afternoon sunlight, felt like a fortress now, a place where power, accountability, and justice intersected. And Marcus realized that while he had walked through humiliation, he had also stepped into a position where his presence demanded immediate respect.
By the time Marcus left his father's office, the atmosphere on campus had shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Word of the incident had spread quickly. Students whispered in hallways, glancing toward the quad where the two officers still lingered, their earlier confidence thoroughly dismantled. The campus security supervisor, who had witnessed part of the confrontation outside, now walked alongside Marcus, her presence both protective and pragmatic. "They've called for a meeting," she said quietly, her tone professional but tinged with unease. Marcus nodded, adjusting the strap of his backpack, aware that the officers were likely pacing near the cruiser, nervously checking their radios, unsure whether to retreat or face the inevitable administrative consequences. As they approached the conference room reserved for urgent matters, Marcus could hear faint murmurs of other staff and faculty gathered nearby, reports, statements, and conversations buzzing with curiosity and judgment. The first officer entered the room, stiff and pale, the mockery and bravado of just minutes earlier replaced by the rigid tension of accountability. His partner followed, eyes darting nervously, clearly unsettled by the realization that this was not a routine stop, and certainly not a simple misunderstanding. The campus security supervisor began calmly outlining the incident, reciting facts and noting eyewitness statements, each detail slowly building the undeniable picture of misconduct and racial profiling. Marcus sat quietly in the corner, maintaining his composure, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers and the officers' uneasy breaths. For the first time, he allowed himself a glance at them, their hands fidgeting, their eyes avoiding his, the weight of recognition settling in. One of the officers attempted a weak smile, muttering, I didn't know," but the words dissolved under the supervisor's steady gaze. Marcus's presence was enough. He didn't need to speak. Silence filled the room, heavy and insistent, each moment a quiet indictment of their arrogance and lack of judgment. Outside the window, sunlight fell across the quad, illuminating the paths they had walked, marking the moment when power, privilege, and assumptions collided, and for once, the assumptions had failed spectacularly.
The tension in the conference room thickened as Marcus remained seated, calm but alert, while the officers fumbled to explain themselves. The first officer's hands shook slightly as he tried to recount the encounter, but his words came out in stammered fragments, each one sounding more like a confession than a defense. "I thought he didn't belong here. The second officer interjected, voice low, defensive, but equally uncertain. "It was just a misunderstanding, sir. I didn't—" The campus security supervisor raised a hand, halting both men instantly, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "There is no misunderstanding," she said firmly. "You made assumptions based on appearance, laughed at a student, and caused public humiliation. That is not acceptable behavior on this campus or anywhere else." The room was silent for a long, heavy moment, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock, each second emphasizing the gravity of their actions. Marcus's father, the university president, had arrived quietly, his presence commanding the room without a single word. He took his seat at the head of the table, reviewing the statements already gathered, then looked up at the officers, his gaze calm but piercing. "You made a mistake," he said, voice low but deadly in its controlled authority. "One that could have serious consequences for your careers, your credibility, and the trust of this university community." The officers swallowed, their earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by an uncomfortable realization of the power dynamics they had ignorantly disrupted. Marcus watched quietly, his expression neutral, but inside a controlled storm of vindication and lingering anger swirled. One of the officers shifted in his seat, clearly grappling with how quickly their authority had been undermined by the simple truth of Marcus's identity. Around the room, staff members exchanged subtle nods, some relieved, others wary of what could come next. Every word, every glance reinforced the stark reality. Assumptions, prejudice, and arrogance could collapse instantly when confronted with truth and accountability. And Marcus, though calm, knew this was only the beginning of the aftermath. the ripple effect of a moment that had humiliated them and exposed the fragile arrogance of authority.
By the next morning, news of the incident had already begun circulating quietly through Hawthorne University, carried on whispered conversations between students in dorms, classrooms, and the cafeteria. Though no official statement had yet been released, the story spread with the speed of wildfire, fueled by the students who had witnessed part of the confrontation and those who had been told the details afterward. Marcus walked across campus, backpack slung over one shoulder, and noticed the subtle shift in how people looked at him. Some gave him curious glances, others respectful nods, while a few whispered under their breath, clearly unsure whether to approach or remain distant. The quad where the incident had occurred now felt charged, every step he took carrying the weight of that moment from the previous afternoon. Across campus, the two officers arrived for their scheduled meeting with the university president, escorted by the security supervisor. Their posture was tense, cautious, each glance at the students around them a reminder that everyone now knew. The officers' internal conversation was a quiet murmur of excuses and self-justification, but it was clear they no longer believed in any easy escape. In the student lounge, a group of classmates had already pulled out their phones, discreetly sharing accounts of the encounter with campus forums, capturing both the humiliation and the abrupt reversal when Marcus's identity had been revealed. Social media buzzed even before official reports could confirm it, a growing narrative that combined shock, anger, and the satisfaction of seeing arrogance humbled. Marcus, aware of the growing attention, kept his composure, navigating the campus hallways with deliberate calm. He observed the reactions, the quick, sidelong glances from some faculty members, the murmurs of approval from peers, and the strained silence from students who might have previously overlooked incidents like this. By the end of the day, it was clear that this was no longer just an encounter between a student and two officers. It had become a campus-wide moment, a tense, vivid lesson in accountability, perception, and the sudden, unyielding power of truth when identity and status collided with prejudice. By mid-afternoon, the university's disciplinary office had summoned the two officers for a formal hearing, the tension in the air palpable as Marcus watched from a nearby observation room. The officers, once confident and laughing, now appeared small and uncertain, their uniforms stiff, badges catching the harsh fluorescent light like reminders of authority they no longer commanded. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers as statements were reviewed. Marcus's father, seated at the head of the table, maintained a calm but immovable presence, his gaze fixed on the officers, evaluating every hesitation, every word, every attempt at justification. "We have reviewed eyewitness accounts, video evidence, and your own statements," he said evenly, voice carrying both authority and judgment. "It is clear that your conduct was inappropriate, humiliating, and discriminatory. Do you understand the severity of your actions?" The first officer nodded quickly, words tumbling out nervously. "Yes, sir, we made a mistake. We didn't—" His partner interjected, voice quivering. "We weren't thinking. We didn't mean to cause harm." Marcus, standing silently to the side, could feel the weight of the room pressing down, the officer's discomfort a stark contrast to his own composed posture. The hearing continued, detailing each action, each word spoken outside on the quad, laying bare the arrogance and racial bias that had fueled the confrontation. The president's tone never wavered, dissecting the situation with precision, leaving no room for excuses or ambiguity. Around the room, staff and faculty observed the proceedings, some taking notes, others exchanging quiet nods. The atmosphere a mixture of tension, anticipation, and validation. By the time the hearing concluded, the officer's fate was clear: written reprimands, mandatory sensitivity training, and a review of their eligibility to remain on campus duty. Marcus left the room with his backpack slung over one shoulder, walking through hallways filled with students and faculty who now regarded him not just as the president's son, but as someone who had endured humiliation with dignity and emerged unshaken. Outside, sunlight spilled across the quad, and for the first time since the incident, Marcus allowed himself a slow, controlled exhale, aware that while justice had been administered, the echoes of the moment would linger far beyond the walls of the disciplinary office. By the following week, the incident had grown into a quiet but undeniable campus-wide conversation. Students discussed it in classrooms, dorm lounges, and the dining hall, dissecting every detail, sharing snippets of video captured on phones, and speculating about the officers' reactions once they realized who Marcus was. Some students expressed outrage, others disbelief that such blatant racial profiling could occur at a university known for prestige and inclusivity, while a few whispered about the potential consequences for campus security and police oversight. Marcus walked through the quad during his lunch break, aware of the shifting currents of attention around him. Friends nodded respectfully, some offering quiet words of support, while strangers looked away, uncertain how to acknowledge the tension his presence now carried. He felt the weight of both the public gaze and the lingering personal sting of being humiliated for something as trivial yet systemic as skin color. His father had made it clear that the officers would face consequences, but Marcus knew the incident was bigger than reprimands. It had opened a window into the larger issues on campus, the assumptions people made, and the subtle forms of bias that often went unchecked. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with a small group of student leaders, discussing ways to foster accountability and ensure the university's policies reflected the values it preached. They spoke candidly, voices low but firm, about how incidents like this affected not only the individuals directly involved, but the entire student body's sense of safety and belonging. Marcus listened carefully, offering his perspective without boasting or drawing attention to his own identity, knowing that true leadership sometimes meant allowing others to take ownership while still guiding the conversation. That evening, as he returned to his dorm, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the quad, Marcus reflected quietly on the thin line between humiliation and vindication, between fear and confidence, and between silence and speaking up. The incident had been shocking, cruel, and deeply personal, yet it had revealed a truth he couldn't ignore. Power, authority, and respect were never guaranteed. They were earned, challenged, and sometimes painfully reclaimed. The day the disciplinary actions were finalized, the officers returned to campus, their movements measured and hesitant, fully aware that their presence was now under constant scrutiny. Marcus walked across the quad that morning, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, and noticed the officer's eyes darting toward him as he passed, a mix of caution, shame, and unspoken acknowledgement in their gaze. Nothing needed to be said. The humiliation, the reversal, and the accountability had already spoken louder than any words. Students lingered in small groups, watching the quiet confrontation from a distance, some whispering, others silently applauding the subtle power dynamics at play. Marcus's father had convened a campus-wide meeting earlier in the week, addressing the incident with a level-headed clarity that balanced accountability with education. The president outlined the importance of fairness, vigilance against bias, and the responsibilities inherent in positions of authority, ensuring that the officer's misconduct was acknowledged, while also framing it as a teachable moment for the university community. That afternoon, Marcus found himself walking through the quad alone, sunlight casting long shadows across the stone pathways, reflecting both the literal and metaphorical journey he had just endured. For the first time since the confrontation, he felt the tension ease slightly, replaced by a quiet sense of justice tempered with reflection. He thought of the officers, their arrogance replaced by humility, their laughter replaced by silence, and recognized how fragile assumptions of power could be when confronted with truth and dignity. The campus felt different now, charged with a renewed awareness that no individual, no matter their uniform or title, could act without consequence, and that courage, calmness, and patience often wielded more power than fear or intimidation ever could. As Marcus ascended the steps to the administration building, he allowed himself a measured exhale, a silent acknowledgement of the ordeal he had endured, the people who had witnessed it, and the subtle shift in campus culture that had been set into motion by a single moment of truth, where laughter had turned to shock, arrogance had met accountability, and dignity had quietly prevailed.